All right, time to set the record queer. I'm in. Welcome to Setting the Record Queer, a podcast where queer people talk about the pursuits and communities they love. This is episode 36, and it's about Synthwave. My name is Alexis, my pronouns are it, its, and she, her, and I'm one of your hosts.
My name's Kaylee, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm your other host.
Oh my god, Kaylee, the Near concert.
Oh yeah, that was great.
Oh my god.
We went to Chicago this most recent weekend for us now. When you're listening to this, it'll have been a couple weekends ago, but it was incredible.
The concert was incredible. The arrangements were amazing. Hearing Emmy Evans perform live was spectacular. I'm running out of positive adjectives here.
Did we actually say what this is, or did we just launch into gushing about it?
Oh, we just launched into just a total tangent, didn't we? We saw a concert of orchestral arrangements from the video games Nier and Nier Automata, as performed by a full orchestra and choir, as well as one of the lead singers from the franchise, Emmy Evans. And it was amazing. Nier's music is incredible, like both games. And they combined this like full orchestra, full choir setup with visuals on a screen, you know, containing words from characters and lyrics and general aesthetic visuals. And it was a really cool show. And also we got to see Yoko Taro show up on stage, donk himself in the Emil head with a microphone, and then conga line the special guests off of the stage.
That was great. If you're very, very into Nier lore, there's like 2 bits of like juicy lore that are only in the concert, because of course there are.
Because Yoko Taro, and of course he would. There was significant lore in the concert. Classic. Other stuff that's going on, slightly more recent, just like 2.5 hours ago, I finally beat Xenoblade Chronicles X, a game that I started back in like February and then put down in the middle of March, when I started playing Final Fantasy XIV. And after 95 hours of in-game time as well, I finally beat the game today, and oh my god, what a good video game. If you like exploration and also robots and or mechs, play Xenoblade X. It's really, really good. And Xenoblade X for Switch when Nintendo. I know not if, but when. The only other thing that's been going on is, I guess, hello from Windows 10. I finally caved and upgraded from 7 because, you know, end of life. And you know what? I gotta say, I feel like I have to say this. After how much I trash on Windows 10, it's all right. The UI is a lot better than with 7, both in terms of the visuals and in terms of like the layout of things. Although it still has the problem that 7 had, where you have a menu that allows you to do some things, and then you click an advanced options button, which takes you to the same menu from Windows XP, which lets you do more things. And so now we're like 4 layers deep in menus in Windows, which isn't great, but otherwise it's good. But yeah, hello from Windows 10. And be glad that I got my podcast recording setup working, I guess, is the takeaway here.
You know, there's something that all 3 of these things have in common. Nier Automata, a game about robots. Xenoblade Chronicles X, a game about robots. And Windows 10, arguably a robot.
Arguably.
Arguably a robot.
You know what? I'll allow it. Continue.
Anyway, that's a transition. Hi, Jess.
Hello, I'm Jess.
Hello, Jess. Another famously terrible Setting the Record Queer guest introduction.
They just get worse every week.
I still can't figure out how to make up good transitions on the fly. I just can't figure it out.
Hey, transition takes a long time.
It does.
That's why episodes of this podcast tend to be somewhere between 3 and 5 years in length.
Nice.
Anyway, Jess, why don't you introduce yourself? Give us your pronouns, tell us what you do, the whole jazz.
Absolutely. So
No, it's not jazz, it's synthwave. Did you even listen to my episode introduction?
Anyway, on my end, it's not Jazz, it's Jess. And my pronouns are she, her. And I am a musician, organizer, writer, couple different things on top of that, but mostly those things. And I am just like incredibly excited to get to talk about my music because that's not a thing I have gotten to do a whole lot. So yeah, thank you for having me on to talk about it.
I would just like to note to add one more layer to that really dumb joke that we did in fact have an episode with someone named Jazz. It was our episode on cosplay and it was really good.
You know, I was thinking that and I was like, should I say that? No, the joke has already overstayed its welcome.
Oh, don't worry. It keeps going. I might be appearing on a podcast with a friend of mine named Jazz, so I'll just have to like keep the running joke
It's
alive.
like a jazz song. It overstays its welcome with 17 solos.
Perfect.
Ouch.
I really like
Scathing.
jazz music. Don't worry about it. All right, well let's jump right into this. So why don't we start? I think this is a good place to start. Can you define synthwave for us as a genre of music?
Yes, because I am asked to do that constantly. Being a
I'm glad
synthwave-
you're prepared.
Yeah, being a synthwave musician is just like answering synthwave. Yeah, what's that? Just over and over again anytime you try to bring it up. And the way I usually describe it is it's like 80s pastiche. Like it's a love letter to the soundtracks to movies like Blade Runner or Escape from New York, and like all of that like synthesizer heavy 80s music that just was a significant part of my childhood, actually. And then has also been associated with like more recent stuff, like the movie Drive sort of established the aesthetic that a lot of synthwave would be in, this very like overdone neon 80s stuff. And yeah, so it's a form of electronic music that really draws upon and parodies lovingly that moment in musical history. And it's also become really associated with cyberpunk, which works really well for me because that's sort of been my whole aesthetic deal for a while. And yeah, it just felt like a very natural fit for me to sink into.
Neat.
So,
I didn't know that it had its history in movies. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think movie soundtracks are really where it started and really where it gains the aesthetic that it had. And then sort of the last 2 decades, it's become popular as a form of parody.
Where does Simpsons Wave fit into this?
Simpsons Wave? You will have to tell me about Simpsons Wave.
Oh no.
Wait, are you not familiar with Simpsons?
I don't know what this is, but I
You know
don't
what?
like it.
We you know what, like 3 of the listeners are gonna be like, oh, Simpsons Wave, and 2 of them are gonna be shaking their heads and the rest of them are gonna be very confused. So let's
And
just
that's
move
why
on.
you should continue this bit to the fullest.
It's very important to get that like niche humor right in there.
How did you get into making music?
Oh no,
And
that's
how did that get into Synthwave?
that is a fun and long story, and always not always so fun, but I think that's part of what's important about it for me. Electronic music has been something that I've been very into as a consumer since high school. I remember a friend in high school like handing me a pair of earbuds and saying, listen to this. And it was Blood Sugar by Pendulum, which is a drum and bass artist. And it was like my whole world changed overnight. I grew up listening to like rock music and country music from my like parents respectively. And then I was like, what is this? There's this whole world here. And sort of spent my next few years really just listening to everything that I could as far as electronic music went. And there was a part of me that was like, what if one day I could make electronic music? But it felt sort of above me. Music was really not a big part of my childhood as far as production. I like played flute in elementary school, which is very trans looking back. And I like had this brief stint in high school where I was gonna drum. I got a very cheap kit and played for like a month, and then my mother sold my kit for some reason. But
Too loud, probably.
yes, that's probably
If I had to make the guess.
they're very. That's the thing is I would still love to pick up an instrumental skill, but the only thing I want to play is drums, and no one around me wants me to play drums. But the point is that like music production and really basic music theory or instrumental skills, none of those were things I really had through most of my childhood and my like teens and 20s. But at some point I was finally just like, I'm not going to let that stop me. I just love electronic music so much. It's such a big part of what I like listen to that I'm like, I'm going to figure out how to make this myself. And I like buy a book on music theory and buy a book on like synthesis. And I'm like, I'm going to work through this. And I went through this process of a few years where I would launch a DAW, so that's like a digital audio workstation. I would launch FL Studio and be like, okay, I'm going to make music. And then I would get like 4 bars over like 3 hours and then just like get very demotivated. Like there were many of those times that sort of ended in tears where I was just like, why can't I do this? I feel like I'm missing something basic. And I went through that sort of over and over again for 2 or 3 years, trying to just be like, how do I make this make sense to me? It just, something felt like everyone else gets this and I don't. And it's funny, actually, what changed that for me was both like the actual just like banging my head against the wall and like making myself experiment, but also it was this one book called How Music Works by John Powell. And it's this dad joke filled book that starts from the really basic, like, why does a note sound like a note? How do the waveforms work? How does your brain interpret that? And for some reason, I just like needed to be able to put it together that way for it to like become accessible to me. And it was from there that I was like, okay, I know how notes work. I know how keys work. I know how all of these things that have been just basic building blocks while I've been plunking around on a keyboard haven't been working for me. Now I understand. And then it was sort of off to the races. In the first 2 years of really like releasing music, I think I put out 5 different releases of varying sizes. Where I was just like, oh my God, I've wanted to do this for so long. Now I can do this as much as I want. It was very exciting.
Dang, 5 releases by the year 2 AP. That's after Powell.
I am infinitely indebted to that book. And every single dad joke made it easier to swallow how like mystified I was. But yeah, so I had been making music for a while at that point. So like a few years of really struggling and then a year of like, okay, I have things I can actually release now. When I decide to experiment with Synthwave, which I mostly did. So my first release was just sort of like electronica, undefined. It's about a space lesbian road trip.
No, please do go on.
Cool. Yeah, let's talk Astrosurf first. So Astrosurf is my first release, and it is about 2 women renting like a Jetson-style car and then like doing a road trip across space together. And it's like little just like stories from their time, but almost entirely instrumental. So almost all of my work is instrumental. And I do a lot of work to be like, how can I deliver a story just from sound? Because almost all of the electronic music that I listen to has always been instrumental, and I've always just been really inspired and motivated by the ways that you can communicate feeling and emotion and even a story just with instruments and no lyrics and vocals. So that first EP, when that was like my debut, was almost entirely instrumental except for a small like vocal interlude. And yeah, it was just like trying to deliver the like happy, fun feeling of being on a road trip with your girlfriend through space and watching shooting stars and all of that. It just like, was very fun. It started with a song called Beach Party on Asteroid 9. I just had this like really like bouncy song that I was like really enjoying, and I had this just sense of, oh, this is what it would be like to be like on a moon and like jumping around for volleyball. That actually ended up becoming the single cover. And so that was a really fun sort of like start to my music career, so to speak, but it wasn't really where I wanted to be in the end. I joked that it's the only thing I've ever produced in the major key. Which I say joke, it probably is the only thing I've ever produced in the major key.
Okay, listen, the major key is for straight people.
The major key is for straight people, and the major key is for Gentiles. That's the other thing. I was like, why do I just keep producing everything in minor? And then I realized, oh, it's because I've listened to music in synagogue my entire childhood, and it's all in minor and
Oh my God,
Friggish.
that was all in minor, wasn't it?
Mhm.
Oh God.
Yup.
Well, you've just explained a lot about my taste in music. Thank you.
I'm so glad I could pass that on, because when I had that moment, I was just like, and everything makes sense. I actually will probably get back to like Jewish music has been influential on my more recent projects, but that's a different thing from where we were. But yeah, Astrosurf is my only thing that's like really upbeat and major and very fun and happy. Not to say there isn't joy in my other work, but from there, I decide to play with Synthwave mostly because I was actually kind of embarrassed at first to be making Synthwave. I probably made a few tweets about just like, oh, of course I end up in Synthwave, because I'm a person with a circuit board tattoo on my scalp that I designed. Like,
It's very good.
thank you. And I've just sort of had this whole cyberpunk aesthetic going on. I used to say that I was basically like I had walked out of a Shadowrun book, was my goal aesthetic. And so I was like, Synthwave makes sense. It's aesthetically fitting. And also it has very specific tools. And that was a thing I felt like very lucky to have at that point, because you're imitating a certain style, a certain 80s style. And so like you use synths that are emulations of synths they use in the 80s. You use drum kits that are emulations or actual samples of drums that were popular in the 80s. You like have a really stark stylistic reference that you can use. And so it was very easy for me to go in and be like, okay, I'm going for this sound. Let me use these tools and get this sound. And it was very easy as a beginner to get into that. But once I started, then it was sort of like I found myself lost in it, especially because I'm a sucker for concept albums. Most of my favorite works of music are concept albums. Of Montreal's Hissing Fauna, Are You the Destroyer is my favorite album. And then there's like instrumental concept albums are even more cool to me, because how do you tell someone a complete story arc with no words? And so as soon as I start making Synthwave, I'm just like, ooh, how do I tell the same sort of stories I'm like telling in my Shadowrun games or telling in the short fiction that I'm writing? How do I tell that in just music with just instrumentals? And when you're pulling from like movie soundtracks, especially, that like makes it easier to like know what to aim for. But it was so fascinating to me to try and like piece together this story. And so my debut album, which is Arcology, is telling the story of a woman. I also joke that all of my music is about lesbians. In some way or some form, it's always about lesbians. So when I was starting to write Arcology, I had actually been writing like a short fiction story about a run, like a Shadowrun run, like a criminal escapade, about in breaking into a tall building in Arcology to do something to like save the protagonist's girlfriend, at like sacrificing herself to do that, which is not strictly the story of Arcology, but it was sort of like, how do I capture that same vibe in this album? And it was in the process of doing that the story started to come out of it. And so Arcology really traces two halves. The first half of the album, prior to the interlude, is her about the unnamed protagonist who's featured on the album cover actually doing the run. And then the second half of it is about coping with what she just did. So the way I sort of imagine it is that this is a big like escalation of the sort of crime she does. And you can hear in Penthouse Showdown Part 2, like gunshot noises that I splice in as like Foley. And she kills people. And that's new for her. And she has to cope sort of in the second half of the album with like, I did that for money and because I could. Like, actually, like, reckoning with that is the very somber tone of the second half of the album. And so I was trying to capture that same vibe of like reckoning with the world that these characters live in that album as I was in that story, and trying to do it entirely with just instrumentals and some occasional Foley. And it was just like a really fun project to do because it really forced me to like sit in the emotions of just the sounds and the instrumentation and be like, how do I communicate these ideas? Archive.
Alexis, did you hear that? We finally got a Foley artist.
Yes! Oh my god, we did it!
Is this something you all been wanting to do?
Oh my god, we've been waiting for that since episode 1!
It's a running joke we have.
Okay, I'm so glad.
Oh my god, I can't believe we got a Foley artist and I didn't even notice.
I'm so glad that my novice skills
I just want to give a shout out to everyone who's been listening since episode 0. Y'all who have been waiting on this journey of 36 episodes to try and find a Foley artist. You are the truest fans and I appreciate you.
I can't wait for the performance showcase in which we can show like a tiny bit of my non-existent Foley skills. It's very exciting. I didn't know I would be so highly anticipated.
One more silly tangent before we get back in.
Yeah.
So how would you say that the like complexity of your music compares to the complexity of Shadowrun 5th edition?
If only I should aspire to that level of complexity.
No, you really shouldn't. You really shouldn't. Shadowrun 5e is a mess.
When I'm describing Shadowrun to new players, I'm just like, the rules of Shadowrun are everything but the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink.
I think in order...
That's extremely accurate.
I think in order for a piece of music to hit Shadowrun's complexity, you need to be able to plug it into an audio, like, you need to be able to plug it into a line-in jack, and it just starts executing some code that's embedded into the per song.
If only.
I mean, you could totally do that. You could put code in audio form. That actually wouldn't be very hard, honestly.
It needs to still sound good, though.
Listenable, yeah.
That is fair.
That'll be my goal for the third album in this trilogy, to make that happen. Which, haven't mentioned that yet. Arcology, which is the album I've been talking about, is the first in a trilogy that happened sort of by accident. Like, I was making Arcology and I released a concept album, and then I started working on more Synthwave, and I was like, wait, I can tie this into the first story. And so then that's how Archive, which is my latest album and the musical work I'm most proud of, happened. And then I was like, wait, I have 2 albums named Arcology and Archive. What if I've got a theme here? So I call them the AR, the augmented reality trilogy, and we have Arcology and Archive and the as of yet unreleased or unstarted, or it'll exist someday, Armageddon.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's a spicy title.
Yes. Oh, I have a lot of ambition for Armageddon, and hopefully someday it'll be extant and in my hands. But yeah, so it's a trilogy where the first one, Arcology, tells that story that I was describing, and then Archive, which is I have such love for Archive. Is like a series of vignettes from the same world. So it's a series of like little stories from between the first one, where everything we talked about happens, and the last album, which, spoiler alert for my last album that doesn't exist, will be where she gets caught for what she did in the first one. Oh, yeah. But, so Archive is like little snapshots and snippets of her life in between until the last song, Omen, which I still think might be the best I've ever done at portraying a feeling and like a, not just a feeling, but like an actual story element using just music. Because I had this moment where I was showing it to a friend of mine, this track, and they said, this sounds like that part of a movie where like the plane is passing like low overhead looking for like a person and like just misses them and doesn't find them. And then I just like lift a finger like, wait, just wait. And at the end of the song, like a minute later, the sound of a helicopter passing overhead plays as like one Foley element, because that was exactly the moment I was going for. And I was just inside like, yes, this is all I've ever wanted as an artist.
That's really impressive that you'd be able to achieve such direct conveyance.
Yeah. And that's one of the nice things about working in Synthwave is that like there are really touchstones in existing like movie soundtrack work that I can pull upon to communicate those ideas to people because they have such strong associations with them. The fact that I succeeded at it was like, yes! Especially because Omen plays a pivotal role where the rest of the album is just like little vignettes. That's the one that puts you back into the story. And so my plan is that the opening of Armageddon, that you could actually like take Omen, which is the last track on Archive, and use it as the first track on Armageddon if you wanted, because it sends you back into that specific world and time. And so the opening of Armageddon will open with the same helicopter sample. And here's a thing that no one in the world would ever notice if I didn't talk about it. So thank you for giving me a platform to share it.
Of course. Go right ahead. That is literally what this podcast is for.
So I was incredibly just like intent to do this, despite the fact it would be completely unnoticeable. On the first half of Arcology, all of the songs are in the exact same key. I can't tell you what key it was, but in the exact same key. And then the interlude is in a different key, and then it proceeds through a number of keys in the back half. So like during the actual story, it is all in the same key. And then there's this like change and shift throughout the latter half of the album. Archive's then like on whatever it wants because it's a series of vignettes. And then Omen, during that last song, it starts in the same key the previous couple songs have been in. And then I pull off a key change right at the end of that track to put us back in the key that the story in the first album was in. That the story
That is amazing.
So that we're like...
And absolutely no one would notice that. You are right.
There was no reason I had to do that. And I went through a bunch of effort to make it happen because I just really, really wanted it. And now it's there. And it's actually... should I spoil like a thing that I now have to live up to it if I say it on this podcast? So
Do it.
Okay. So one of the tracks on Armageddon, I've already spoiled that it's going to be about her getting caught. But one of the tracks is going to be them showing her footage of them having caught her. Like, oh, we have you on camera sort of deal. And I want to take musical motifs and like even some of the like synthesizer patches I used on Arcology on the first 4 tracks, because they're all in the same key. I can weave some of them together all into one track in order to convey, hey, we're showing you footage of a time in the past. And so I needed to be back in that key if I was going to stay in that key to go into footage. So that's what Omen does. And I'm very proud of it, even if it won't matter to anyone but me.
That's amazing.
Thank you. I think my music is full of little touches like that because for me, it's about the way I like communicate, and not even communicate, but just like capture a story. It's really important to me that I am like doing something very specific and doing everything I can to make it cohesive. And as my skills have improved, I've been able to do that better, which has been really nice. It's part of why Archive is probably the only album of mine I can actually really listen to. But it's been nice to like get a fuller repertoire in order to be like, I want to communicate this idea here. I want that to flow into this like this, and really be able to do that. And coming into my own like that has just been the most wonderful and satisfying thing.
Just in case people want to listen to this music, which they do, Trust me. There will be a link to Jess's Bandcamp in the show notes, so go click that, go listen to those. You'll get one song in the performance showcase later, but you should go check that out.
Thank you. I appreciate the plug.
So without getting like too deep into the weeds of like music and like composition theory, you've mentioned like using all sorts of different techniques to get, certain keys and transitions and that sort of like a musical identity. So what sort of stuff are you using to do that? Like just a surface level run of some music and composition theory stuff that's in your toolbox.
Yeah, I guess as far as compositional techniques, there's not as much that leaps out to convey at a surface level. But one thing I can point to is like, how do I capture those 80s sounds? Which allows me also to set people who have that expectation into that world, and into the world of those like movies and things like that. There was actually this post, which if you were thinking of getting into synth run, I just combined synthwave and outrun, which is another name for this genre. So I've invented synth run, which is the same thing as both synthwave and outrun.
Oh boy, I've always wanted the combination of synthwave and synthwave.
Synthwave 2.
I'm at the synthwave. I'm at the synthwave. I'm at the combination synthwave and synthwave.
Synth squared wave.
Synth squared wave squared. Okay. Synth Run is my favorite Shadowrun 5e lore expansion. It's about Seattle 2078's music scene.
I'm just gonna remix all this synthwave into synthwave.
Okay, so there's this Reddit post that is called Giant Massive List of Synthwave and Outrun VSTs and Samples. And it is a godsend. It just has like every both free and paid tool that you could want for like capturing those sounds. In particular, I make heavy use, especially on Archive. I start to make more use of like the Korg Legacy collection and FM8, which is almost like 60% of the synths on Archive are probably from FM8, which is a frequency modulation synth that is imitating the Yamaha DX7, which was used in a lot of 80s movies. It was a really popular synth in that time. And so by drawing upon those familiar sounds, it becomes much easier to immediately set people into that context. And there's also, speaking of techniques, here's one. Gated reverb was really, really popular in that time. And so what that means is that like got a drum hit, and then you'll have reverberation, that sort of like shh, that might follow a hit. And gating it means that once it gets below a certain level, once it gets like quiet in a certain way, it just immediately cuts out. It's not like a nice, smooth, steady decay. It's a shh, shh. And that sort of like style for drums becomes really recognizable. Like listen to any 80s, even like 80s pop music, you'll hear it really, really heavily. And so I grabbed this like, I think it's like PCM Native Reverb's vintage plate, something like that, something to imitate 80s reverb. And then everything on Archive has gated reverb because it just creates that sensation. But
I thought about jumping in there to interject and try and give a simple definition of frequency modulation synthesis. And then I realized there's absolutely no way I can define FM synthesis in less than several minutes. So just know it's a musical technique for creating sounds that you often hear in the 80s.
I am, on the other hand, going to prevent our editor from editing out your stumble over your words, because now I'm thinking of like the Star Wars synthesis.
Oh god, that would be lovely.
I am Darth Synthesis.
Oh my god. I bring you feedback.
That's good. That's a good bit. Good job, team.
But yeah, no, I also considered explaining FM synthesis, and I realized I've released 2 albums that draw primarily on FM synthesis, and I only barely understand FM synthesis, so I'm not going to try and explain it to our listeners. It's wonderful.
I understand it, but I can't explain it. Mm-hmm. I could make it worse by saying that it's effectively stacking sine waves at different frequencies. But again, I cannot actually explain it in less than several minutes, so
It makes good sounds. I recommend them.
it does make good sounds.
Uh,
It's what the Genesis sounds like for those of you who are more gaming people than music people. The Genesis has an FM chip.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, it uses a, oh god, I don't remember it. Yamaha YM something that's the same one used in a lot of synthesizers from the time. All right, well, we had like 2 other questions here, but you managed to weave them all into that. Reminder that we've done exactly 1 question so far.
But it covered the topic. Well, to be fair, we branched off in a few places. We got places we wanted to go.
Yeah, no, this is not a bad thing, but we have done 1 question off of the show notes so far.
Yeah, but then
anyways,
we cut 4 because we covered all of
branching
them.
into what would be question like 4 or 5 and is now question effectively 2. What is your composing process?
Is Mania a bad
This
answer?
is always the hardest question, no matter what media we have someone working on.
It's my composing process is that I'll open up, a DAW or something like that, and plunk around and get a sound that I really like. Often it'll just be like a 4-bar loop that I really like, and then be like, oh, I need this in my life, and really dive into it. Most of my songs, especially on Archive, started as 4-bar loops that were like, I really like this set of notes. I'm going to add a layer on top of it. I'm going to add another layer on top of it. I'm going to add another layer on top of it. And I spend like days and days on those like 4 bars until I have a loop that I like really, really like. And then I'm like, okay, now let's explode this. Let's like send this out into a bunch of different sections and combine them in different ways and find ways to vary it. And I think there are ways that that's been limiting for me as an artist, that like my more recent work, I've been trying to branch out to different production processes. But it was really good just to be like, let's concretely get something on the metaphorical page and get like a 4-bar loop I really like to listen to. And then I can turn it into so much more. In fact, like most of my released work, there's still a file floating around somewhere of the 4-bar loop that began it. So it's very fun to like listen to it and then compare it. But getting it from one to the other is the really challenging part. And that's often like manic hyperfocus, where I'm just like, okay, I have this 4-bar loop. I desperately want to show it to people as a song. So let me just like pick 2 or 3 weekends where I do nothing but work on this one loop and get it out into a song and then hopefully out into the world. Arcology and Archive were both made in 3 months, 4 months, something like that. Just like on nights and weekends. And fun fact for both of my releases, if not all of my releases, I set the release day before the album is done, which some of my other musician friends are like, I cannot imagine doing that. But it's just one of the few ways for me to like make myself finish. I like always can be tweaking more. I can always be adding more. I can always be expanding. But when I'm like, no, it has to be done by then I just like sit down and make myself make decisions. And that's sort of how the final sprint worked for every one of my releases. The other big part of it, so I've sort of covered the beginning of my process, which is always just like plunking around and getting those nice loops. The back half, when I'm mixing and mastering, it is listening to it on every form that I can. So like laptop speakers, phone speakers, headphones, like both cheap earbuds and like noise canceling headphones, my monitors. Like I'm just playing it. If you are around me, if you live in my house when I'm about to make have a release, you just hear my music constantly everywhere because I'm just trying to listen to it in every like different shape and format. And even before the mixing and mastering process, honestly, I will often like, and when I'm stuck on a song too, I'll just like take it and listen to it while walking around the city. I have a lot of memories of like particular songs where it's like, okay, I don't know where to go from here, so I'm going to take this song with me, and I just go for a walk and listen to the song over and over and over again until something hits me and I'm just like, okay, I need to hum that, not lose it, get home, put it in my DAW, sometimes like make a little voice memo on my phone of me humming along to my own song. But the back half of any of these involves a lot of like repetition and listening to it wherever I can and in new environments and in new ways, both because it helps me prepare it to be heard on those types of sound system, but also just because it's creative. When you hear it in new ways, it gives you new ideas.
I don't know where to go with this song. I'll go outside.
Exactly. That is a place the song can go. We can physically change its location.
I'm curious, do you use any real synthesizers or do you use all patches and software?
That's a great question. So I started like all digital. And then early when I was like experimenting, I ended up getting a Korg Volca, which is this like tiny synth. It's one of the like cheapest analog synths to exist. And I like plinked around on it. And then ended up upgrading to a Novation Base Station 2, which is another like larger analog synth. And I really enjoyed those for their limitations. When I was teaching myself like synthesis and sound design, like I just plunked around on those synthesizers for like hours trying to figure out, why does this thing do that thing and connect to that thing? And how does that affect the sound? But they were mostly learning tools for me. Almost all of my released music has been nearly entirely digital. The only thing on AstroSurf to be analog in any way is not any of the synthesizers. It's actually, I was trying to get the sound of like going over like a cheap, awful radio because I was trying to capture like two people outside in EVA suits, like talking over the radios in their suits. And I spent hours trying to figure out, how do I make an effect that sounds like being over a cheap, awful radio? Until I realized I can buy a cheap, awful radio and just record myself speaking through it. So I bought like $10 walkie-talkies and recorded myself speaking through it instead of, I was like, why did I spend hours trying to do this instead of like, I just have the objects now. But that's the only analog thing on AstroSurf.
Yeah, I took a sound design class, and one of the pieces of software we worked with had a bunch of like modeled different speakers and stuff. And most of the time it is just easier to go to your local Walmart and buy a cheap walkie-talkie.
Right, right. It's just so much easier. The physical world exists. Who knew?
You gotta take your music outside.
If there's one lesson to take away from today's episode.
Your music needs regular walks to get its energy out.
Remember to keep a plastic baggie, so just in case you need to clean up after your music. if your music has to go and spills beats all over the sidewalk.
If you drop a few bass notes.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. That might be the funniest joke that anyone has ever made on this podcast.
Okay.
Good job, wife.
So, yeah, that was the only thing to be like, I didn't use any like analog synthesizers or even any like physical synthesizers, even digital. It was all in my DAW. Arcology, I don't think used any. And then Archive, it used two physical devices, one of which I used to tell people it was one, and I realized while reviewing for this podcast that I had been lying the entire time.
Ironically, you are on this podcast now to set the record straight.
Oh no, what have I done? I feel like I've betrayed the mission. Okay, it's okay. We can brave this. We can tolerate one straight thing. Can we? I don't know how committed I am to that bit. No, actually, it was pitch bent. The specific sample I'm referring to is pitch bent. There is nothing straight here, I promise.
We did it. We saved the podcast.
We saved
We're
the
all
podcast.
good.
But yeah, so that one sample, which comes from, or not comes from, but is on Rivet, which is a song near the end of Archive, and it's this like really oppressively loud, scratchy sound in the background, was me just like turning that Novation Base Station up to like destroying it. Like I had just like absolutely wrecked the sound, but I really liked it. It's this like really repetitive and it's going to come over great audio. But yeah, it's this very repetitive sound that I recorded into my computer in like 2015 and then didn't find a use for until 2018 when I was making Archive. And so it just like sat around as an audio file to the point where I'd forgotten, oh, I recorded that on a physical synthesizer 3 years ago. Quick tip for aspiring artists out there, always cannibalize yourself and always keep your experiments around. Always bring them back. But yeah, so that was technically a piece of physical instrumentation, but I used it more like a sample. And then the only other piece on Archive is for Omen. I have some like synth guitar, and I couldn't find a reverb pedal or reverb plugin that I liked as much as the TC Hall of Fame reverb pedal I had from the brief awful experiment I had in playing guitar. And so I sent the entire track out of my audio interface into the TC reverb pedal and then back into the audio interface just to get that reverb on the synth guitar track because I could not find anything else I was happy with. And those are the only pieces of physical instrumentation on my released EPs and albums. But my more recent work, there's not really anything to show for it, but the things I've been like futzing around with recently have involved some more physical instrumentation. So I've taken up some like hand drumming, and I've been playing with a couple different hand drums that I hope to get to use on a release someday. And then I also sold a bunch of my equipment, including the Volca and the Novation Base Station, all of that, to get an OP1, Teenage Engineering's OP1. It's this like little device. It's a digital synthesizer that like, God, how do I describe an OP1? It's an entire workstation at this like synthesizer the size of like a keyboard, like a computer keyboard. And it is the coolest little thing. Just like a really fascinating interface, a bunch of different sounds, a 4-track recorder. And I watched a lot of this YouTube series called Red Means Recording, where the person who does the series, like, it's just a camera pointed at the synthesizer and his hands, and he walks through the entire process of making a track. And it was so helpful for me because you actually get to see his process, not just the final result and not just a tutorial. And that like really, I watched so much Red Means Recording to learn how to have a workflow. And so he does almost all of that on an OP1. And so after years of watching it, I finally caved and was like, I need an OP1 myself. I need this device. And so I've been playing a lot with that little thing, and I'm hoping to eventually release some music that comes off of it. So in the future, there might be more both like physical synthesizers, but also like other forms of instrumentation, like percussive instrumentation that I'm recording myself, and we'll see how that goes.
Well, I'm excited to find out. So let's take an abrupt transition here because I don't have a good segue. And how would you describe the relationship between your songs and your personal identity?
It's a really good question. I think, like I mentioned, all of my music is about lesbians. It always is in some way, shape, or form. Even the things that are like singles, there's a couple singles I have which are more explicitly gay in some ways because they have lyrics. But like, I don't know, just like being gay and trans like pervades my social spaces. It pervades the media that I consume. It pervades like the ways that I relate to people. And so when all of my music is meant to capture a story and it's meant to capture dynamics between human beings, it's sort of necessary that that's a part of it, and that those cultures and those histories are always a part of it in some form. I think it's also captured in the relationships between the people I work with. So I have like worked with other people to both get feedback or even like collab on certain songs, and most of my collaborators are also fellow queer people, and so that comes across too. And then for a long time, being extremely cyberpunk was also a part of my identity, so I think we've already established that connection. but like it was also sort of a self-expression thing, right? The cover of Arcology shows this like character with short blonde hair and a leather jacket, like standing next to a motorcycle overlooking a city. And it was in some ways like an aesthetic goal for myself that I was drawing into my music there, that I feel like in some ways I've fulfilled in the time since, which has been good. So it was also like a sort of exploration of self-identity. Music is also more than the music. It's how you release it and what you name it and what the album art is and all of these other things. And when I said earlier about how important it is for me to have something that's like really cohesive and thought through narratively, that includes all of those things. So I work with a really fantastic artist named Marlon, Artsy Robo on Twitter, who has done almost all of my album covers for like my EPs and albums. And that's a part of it. And how I like capture and explore identity, and you can look on the album arts to see this, is reflected in Marlon's art. I know I already mentioned the like short hair blonde character from the cover of Arcology, but I've told people before that I was very influenced by science fiction growing up. This probably isn't very surprising considering everything I've talked about, but shows like Battlestar Galactica, Stargate SG-1, just a bunch of different shows, all of which seem to feature the same feisty, slightly butch-ish woman with short blonde hair who is smarter and more capable than everyone else around her. And for all of the ways in which science fiction does not treat its women well, those characters were still like very inspiring, and like I just personally related to them in a way that young baby trans me did not really understand. And I've joked that my goal has just been to transition into Samantha Carter from Stargate SG-1 or Starbuck from Battlestar Galactica for if the first one doesn't land. And both the cover for our Astrosurf and the cover for Arcology feature a character who's very much in the same vein and was a form of early self-expression. I think before I was willing to like test out that aesthetic myself, I could test it out in my art and in my characters. And I could say like, this is an aspirational thing, and I can make art that captures it. And then maybe I'll feel comfortable like actually stepping into it. And lo and behold, I have, and I'm feeling pretty good about that. But I think it really formed a playground for me to play with my own identity. And yeah, I just hope that comes through in the music in a way that feels good for people.
Let's move on to talking about the community around your work. So is there a community that you interface with, both in terms of like maybe people who listen to your music and in terms of like other composers or writers in the like synthwave space?
Yeah. So I think early on, I really didn't have a lot of community, which was also very hard. That like I really didn't know a lot of people who even like liked electronic music when I was first experimenting. Like there was like 2 or 3 years where I was really banging my head against the wall. But I've found a lot more community in the time since then, which has been really nice. And it was also part of how I was able to like grow creatively, was to actually have people to like talk to about this and listen to their work and talk to them about their work. Was really productive and was part of the shift that allowed me to make more music. I met the vast majority of those people, the same place that the vast majority of my listeners come from, the same place that you all found me, the same place that is the reason that anyone knows my music whatsoever, which is Twitter. A place that has played a surprisingly and sometimes sadly large role in my life. But yeah, I had sort of cultivated a cyberpunk aesthetic Twitter in some ways. I've done a number of photo shoots that were very like cyberpunk themed that had gotten somewhat popular. And then I was like, I'm making synthwave now. And it was such a natural transition into that, that a lot of my early listenership comes from those people who were like, oh, cool cyberpunk. And then they were like, oh, cool cyberpunk music. And I was like, nice, this is cool. Someone's listening to my music. I didn't expect that. But yeah, I think that's where I've met a lot of people. And then also like in the trans woman Twitter internet, there's a lot of electronic music artists, which has been pretty neat because again, it was a thing where like I didn't know other people into electronic music for many years in my life, or at least not into it in the same way I was. And so it's been nice to have that sort of camaraderie. And then another funny like little interconnection. One of the first like really distinctly and like self-identified synthwave that I listened to and really liked was Neon Shutter's Hex Phase. It's an EP, and I found it through the Dustrial Tumblr. So Dustrial is like a cyberpunk clothing brand that I was known for wearing in a bunch of my photo shoots.
I have a tank top from them. It's really good.
It's so good. It's so good. I have so much dust. I have an embarrassing amount of Dustrial clothing. But the Dustrial Tumblr shared Neon Shutter's music, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I don't remember how it ended up happening, probably through one of my photo shoots getting retweeted by Dustrial. But Neon Shutter, James, the guy who's behind that project, like mutualed me from Dustrial. And so then we ended up like collaborating on music. And so there's this like little weird entanglement between like me, cyberpunk aesthetic, Tumblr and Twitter, and the synthwave world that all like wrap in together into this weird conglomeration of music and aesthetic photo shoots that played an important role in my life for a good amount of time.
At Dustrial, sponsor us, please and thanks.
Oh, I have so many times just been like, do you know how many people have responded to my photo shoots telling me they were buying from Dustrial? I've been doing free advertising and I should get paid for this. But I guess the real cyberpunk future is when the corporations use us for profit and don't give us any money for it, huh?
Do we want to be in the cyberpunk future? I thought we didn't want to be in the cyberpunk future.
I don't really think we're getting a choice at the moment, sadly.
Oof.
Well, with that note,
Ooh.
let's veer quickly into the next question.
I can veer quickly into communist organizing if we want to talk about how to respond to the cyberpunk future.
So, I think you touched on this a little bit, but let's go a little more into it. How's being queer in the synthwave community?
I think in the like small corner of it that I'm in, which is mostly made up of queer people, has been like really okay and fun. I rarely venture out of that corner, and I think the experience could be very different. I once like joined some like Facebook synthwave group, and like I saw the like large number of 20-something white dudes, like very bro EDM concert goers, and I was just like, I'm gonna back away slowly now because you all did not respond well to the like 2 times women posted in this group. So I'm just gonna not do that. And so there's this balance between like, I actually really appreciate the queer electronic music community I'm a part of. There's not like necessarily a big synthwave component of it, but it's enough for me to be in the electronic music part of it, especially because synthwave has been what's like natural and made sense for me, but it's not really where I'm attached to as far as electronic music goes. And in fact, I'm sort of hoping my eventual projects outside of Armageddon will branch out of synthwave a little bit. But the queer electronic music community has been a really cool place to be, and like it's been nice to collaborate and get feedback from people and also just see the really amazing work coming out. And then the synthwave community, I don't know that I really have one besides lurking on the subreddit sometimes. And I think part of that might be due to being queer and also just being a woman, and it's dominated by men, especially in the internet spaces, I should say. For me, a lot of that community really is an online one. And I think I do find myself wishing for a little more of a like local queer electronic music community. But there are other forms of music that I have found local community for, which has been nice. And then fun thing about electronic music is it's electronic. You can send wave files back and forth. It's a very convenient way to collaborate and get feedback and all of that. Yeah, in fact, a couple of my releases have like a thank you section where it's mostly just like people that I subjected to / who volunteered to listen to my songs over and over again with slight tweaks and have give me feedback because I'm very like I get very uptight about it. And so I think more than anything, it is just like kind and compassionate friends who are willing to like listen to my music and give me feedback and give me their opinions, whether they produce music or not, has been the most important form of community that I've had, is just having people who like care and I have relationships to, and they'll give me honest feedback about my music is sort of more important than anything else. And then there's also, I guess, the relationship to the people who listen to my music, which is still like a phrase that I'm getting used to existing, people who listen to my music. And one of the fun part about like all of my publicity, or however you want to phrase it, coming from Twitter, is that I really have a direct line to those people. And so I'm often very on main about like, oh, I'm working on this song. Oh, I'm trying to get this done in time. Oh, I'm thinking about maybe doing this. And like, I can be in direct conversation with the people who are going to be listening about the process and about like what it meant to me or any of those things. And so it's very cool to just sort of have an open line of communication with any of the people who would realistically probably listen to it. And that has felt really nice as an artist.
So what inspirations do you have musically? I know you mentioned like, a lot of the ideas of synthwave coming from movies and other stuff like that from the 80s and imitating the 80s style, but what other musicians inspire your work?
Yeah. So there are some who are like explicitly synthwave musicians who were inspirational for me. Years back, I was listening to people like Laserhawk and Perturbator and other people who make like in that synthwave stuff now. And then there's like smaller artists who like I mentioned, like, getting to work with Neon Shutter was really cool because it was one of the first synthwave albums I actually listened to. But a lot of my inspiration does also come from outside of the explicitly synthwave world. I actually have a little playlist on Spotify called Quine Inspiration. Wow, it has been a very long time into the podcast. I have not mentioned the artist name that I use for releasing synthwave because I use vanity labels for all of my different projects. So Astrosurf was self-titled. My archive and Arcology are released under Quine. My other work is released under Liquid Crystal. So there's a late little addition, but there's a playlist I have on Spotify that I can like link in the episode description or in the Discord or wherever makes sense, called Quine Inspiration, where I just like put in all of the music that really directly inspires my work. Some of my songs are even, to admit something here, like very directly like, ooh, that one song would fit really well in my story here. What if I made something kind of like it? What if I like pulled some techniques from it? Like there's a song from an artist called Juno Reactor called Masters of the Universe. And some people might know it because it's in the Animatrix, the animated Matrix short films.
I'm actually familiar with something. I'm never familiar with anything when people are talking about musical stuff, but I actually know this.
Yeah, there's a song called Masters of the Universe, and it was just like exactly what I wanted to capture in both On the Run and there's the song called Masters of the Universe, and it was exactly what I wanted to capture in Penthouse Showdown Part 2, and also the two songs after it, kind of. And so those songs take like a really direct inspiration from like, how do they capture the like chase scene that's ongoing in the Animatrix when that song is playing, and it borrows directly from like the like weird vocal chorus that they're doing in the background of that song. And I like took a synth chorus and like tweaked it a little bit, but I was like, oh, that gives the sort of feeling that I want. But not all of them are quite as direct theft or pastiche or flattering copying as that. Some of them are more just like music that was influential in the past for me. Especially, there's an album from Decepticon, so that's like Decepticon with a K in the third to last letter, called Mythology of the Metropolis. And it's an almost entirely instrumental concept album about the like downfall of humanity and like uprising of the robots and then the humanity's rebellion. And it is a thing that was really influential on me because it was an example of an entirely instrumental concept album that was so compelling to me that I was like, oh, you can do this. Like that was something I listened to back in 2013 where I was just like, this is the exact sort of style of electronica that I really liked. That's really instrumental, really low key in a lot of different ways, but that tells a really compelling story and does it through a combination of like setting emotion, little bits of Foley or sampling, the song titles, the just like, how do you holistically portray this? And so that was like really deeply influential on me. And I think bits of my work is a love letter to that album. But yeah, it's a lot of different places I pull from, but those especially stand out to me.
Okay, well, if someone listening wants to get started doing synthwave, what would your recommendation be for them to get their feet wet, start creating?
I can take a few different tacks at answering this. One of them is that I actually put out like a 3-page Google Doc guide that was like Liquid Crystal's guide to getting started with electronic music.
And if you send us the link to that, we can put it in the show notes.
Perfect. Great. But also, because this is an audio format show, I can also talk about it a little bit, which might make some sense.
Yes, but we can also put it in the show notes.
Yes, perfect. But yeah, I think to some degree it really depends on both where you are and what sort of person you are. So for some people, they just want to sit in front of like a keyboard, whether that's like a MIDI keyboard or just their keyboard, their computer keyboard acting as a keyboard, and just like plunk on some notes until they have something that sounds good. And if that's where you're at, go to that giant, massive list of Synthwave and Outrun VSTs and pop them open in some sort of digital audio workstation and go to town. See what you like. Like, play around until something feels good and write it down immediately and then layer on top of it. But if you're a person who like really needs a deep understanding first, then like dig into the music theory, but also just dig into like, why do things sound the way they do? Why do notes work the way they do? There's a reason that book was so important for me, because I'm a sort of the one we mentioned earlier, how music works, because I just really need to understand the full pieces in play for me to learn something. But if you're just at first trying to get started with electronic music, what I would say more than anything is make yourself write. Like, make yourself open up a digital audio workstation or grab a synthesizer and just play around. Make sounds, lay down a series of notes. It's not going to sound great at first, and that's okay. It took me like 3 years to complete a song for the first time. If it's a year in and you're just starting to finish a song, you're not doing anything wrong by being frustrated and having to go at it again and again. It takes that to like learn how to express yourself in those tools. And I know the big transition for me was when it was like, oh, I can actually put my hand to a keyboard and like have something come out that was what I wanted to say. That the tools are actually expressing what is inside of me instead of me having to wrestle with the tools. And the main way that happens is practice. The main way that happens is just like getting to know them in an intimate way that they become another appendage for you. And so give yourself time to fail and keep going at it. And if you are specifically looking to be like, okay, I know how to make electronic music, or I know how to make music, how do I make synthwave? Then download some VSTs and patches and samples that sound like synthwave, and then also listen to things in the genre. One of the things that you have to do on top of experimenting is listen critically. Is like listen to a song and be like, why was that transition there? What different layers are going on here? And how is the artist creating those? Really listening with an active ear is an important part of becoming more capable as an artist. And so if you're trying to make synthwave, both listen to the recent stuff, listen to like Perturbator and Kavinsky and Laserhawk and all these other like bigger name synthwave artists, but also like go to the source material. Listen to the soundtrack to Blade Runner, the soundtrack to Escape from New York, or listen to the soundtrack to Drive, even talking a little more contemporarily. Like, listen to them and appreciate them musically, or even watch the movies and be like, how do they set the tone and how are they delivering these ideas? And I think if you're trying to go beyond just how do I make music into a how do I capture the specific feeling, listen to how the greats did it and like pay attention.
So before we get moving into our performance showcase here, what projects are coming up for you? I know you have Armageddon on the plate in production. And do you have any like shows as well?
Oh, I wish I had shows. I've been invited for a few shows, but as I alluded to earlier, I have no instrumental skills. One thing to know about all my music is that almost all of it is me drawing out notes on a piano roll, which, by the way, those people who want to learn to do electronic music, your lack of instrumental skills don't have to stop you. It's certainly frustrating for me, but I've done multiple releases without it. But it does mean that performing live would be very tricky for me. Hopefully, someday I will get familiar enough with an actual keyboard to feel comfy performing live. But even if that's not going on, I do have some like musical experiments going on. I've been playing with the OP1 and I've got some more like ambient tracks that I'm working with. And then I've also been trying to just like branch outside of Synthwave with the electronica I'm making. And there's one or two songs that I'm just like, I wish I had something to put these on because I do actually want to share them with people. We'll see where that goes. But in all honesty, I'm not working on music very much right now. The state of the world being how it is, I'm a lot more focused on like organizing efforts and my writing. I also run a Patreon for my writing where I write mostly about like politics, communism, feminism, Judaism, the overlap of all of these things. And so that's the bulk of my like creative output, so to speak, right now. But I am really hopeful that at some point I will actually be able to sink back into music and finalize some of these things and get them out to people. And in the meantime, I'm also like branching out. So I've been writing some like Jewish music that I'm like singing in my synagogue, that I don't know if that'll like ever see the light of day in a recorded format, but like having those broader skills also informs the rest of my music, which has been really fun. And trying to gain some like percussive skills and stuff like that. And who knows, maybe that'll come to fruition at some point. Yeah.
All right, well, with that, let's dive into our performance showcase. So for this performance showcase, obviously this is a musical guest, so what else would we do but play a song? So today, Jess has selected for us Slow Dive from Archive. So Jess, before we take a listen to this, why don't you kind of set the scene as to what has happened into the album up to this point, and where listeners would be when they get to this track?
So, Slow Dive is my opening track on the album, and it was actually very, I struggled with whether to put Slow Dive or Glass and Steel as the opening track, because Glass and Steel is my personal favorite, but I think Slow Dive is a bit more of a crowd pleaser. And it also works well as an opening because, as you will see, there's like a little Foley start that gives a particular idea. But because of that, I don't think there is a ton of context. I can talk about what you're going to hear and see, but I think I would be more intrigued to do so after it plays. You are, at least in the general universe of my trilogy, she completed the run, got a bunch of money, and now she gets to do stuff with that money. And that's a lot of what like Archive is capturing, is like, how does she live in the meantime? And Slow Dive captures one example of how she lives in the meantime.
All right, let's take a listen. All right. Welcome back from that comfy synthwave listening session. That was some good stuff. I enjoyed that. I don't feel like I understood it, but I enjoyed that.
It sounds good in ears. That's about the extent of my musical analysis capabilities.
I got the vibe of like joyride through like across like the cyberpunk future highways. I don't know if that was right at all.
Then it was actually very satisfying for me to hear that, because yes. So the two little vignettes that the first two songs represent are sort of like connected ones, where Slow Dive, which people always call Slow Drive, and I have to be like, it's okay. It opens with the sound of a car. There's a reason why people think it's called that. It just happens. I have to chill about it. But the reason it's called Slow Dive is that it's not just like not just a car. It's about the sensation of like out on the town, too cool for school, to borrow two very old phrases. That like it's the opening of her sort of like wealth and exploring what that means and whether that actually makes her happy. So the imagery, really a lot of the songs on Archive in particular were pulled from like specific imagery that informed the vignette. So that one for me was like a black, maybe like Lamborghini, like driving down like a blue neon lit highway in like the middle of the night, just sort of like showing off like whose nice car is that, and just going further and further into like densely urban city. So like Slow Dive actually comes from the idea of like going in further, being surrounded by more and more people, more and more business, more and more just like spectacle that is like watching her and appreciating like her wealth and power and sort of how she feels about that. But what you were saying about like driving down the cyberpunk highway, that's exactly what it is. And it's just meant to be this like increasing sense of like, oh, look how cool I am. Look at how I have this like beautiful car and nice speaker system. Isn't that so great? And then when that's not satisfying, it moves into Mainline, which is the following track, which if you go and listen to the album, you can hear, which is the version of the, okay, now I'm like on an open road in the middle of the daytime, like gunning it, because like that wasn't satisfying. What other sort of like ways can I attempt to seek the adrenaline rush that I am looking for? And so they're like set up as like back-to-back songs that talk to each other.
I'm glad I got it right.
I am too. And it's one of those places where I think the Foley like helps set that, right? Like the little like engine startup noise in Drive, like really like puts you into something, and then at the end it cuts out. And it's also just nice to set an 80s pastiche thing with a cassette tape starting at the beginning of the song. Just a very convenient cue. I think in Archive especially, it's really about capturing a particular imagery or emotion more than it is about capturing a discrete story the way Arcology is. And if I've communicated that to you, then I'm very happy, and it seems like I have. I also now have my own like mixed imagery for it because of the fact that there's a music video for it, actually. I'm realizing we might not have talked about that. This really fantastic artist, Gabby Mismash, so like at Gabby Mismash, MISMASH on Twitter, did this really cool glitched out Tron music video for that song. So like I once hopped on one of like Gabby's Twitch streams, and she was just like live glitching VHS along to music using like a video synthesizer, and it was the coolest thing. And then she ended up glitching some of my music, and I was like, do you want to make a music video out of this? And so she used a bunch of footage from like the original Tron movie, glitched with a video synthesizer, and set to Slow Dive for a music video. And I'm just like still so glad it exists, and I think it captures a different but like related sensation and feeling from that original imagery, which feels really nice. And also, considering the original artist for the Tron soundtrack was a trans woman, it was really nice to like dedicate that video to Wendy Carlos.
I did not know that.
And
is
she's
cool.
basically the godmother of electronic music.
Yep.
Her album Switched on Bach was like a lot of what's credited with starting electronic music, and a trans woman.
Yeah, Wendy Carlos, amazing. 10 out of 10 human being.
She's incredible. Just absolutely incredible. But also, when we came back and you were saying just like a like smooth or relaxing, or I can't remember the exact wording, like synthwave experience, That's another thing that like Slow Dive was meant to give, and it's part of why it's the opening song on the album. Whereas I think some of the later ones are a little more like ambitious. That like I really put a lot of work to just make something that was like really pleasant and enjoyable to listen to, both as a way of like introducing people into the album, and then also it's really where I really improved my mixing and mastering skills, which is a lot of what make a music experience in the background be like really enjoyable and like easy. In Arcology, I keep telling myself that I'm gonna do a remaster of Arcology and re-release it because I did not know how to mix and master, because it's a very different skill than making the music. Like blending everything together is a very different skill. But for Slow Dive, I actually got help from Lila at Riglow, Riglow, on Twitter, who's an audio engineer, who like sat down with me and was like, okay, I'm going to teach you some skills for mixing and mastering that I ended up applying to the rest of the album. But we really tested that on Slow Dive. And I think the quality of the mixing and mastering on that track really comes through and is part of what makes it more pleasant on the ears. And also, Riglow has fantastic music, so I highly recommend you check out their music.
All right, well, you kind of answered all of the questions that I had. And in the interest of time, I think we let that piece stand for itself. It was real good, and we let it stand for itself, but also you kind of said everything that I could have thought to say about it. So
cool. I'm glad.
So for every episode of this podcast, we take questions from you, our listeners, for us and for our guests. And we do that on our Twitter at STRQueercast, in our Setting the Record Queer Community Discord at bit.ly/STRQcord, and via email, settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com. So our first question this week comes from Delphine in Discord, who asks, what tools do you recommend for someone trying to get into computer music for the first time, especially for someone on a budget who might not be able to afford Pro Tools or FL Studio? So we already talked a little bit about getting into it, but I am curious about like specifically your tool recommendations.
So the very first thing I worked with was LMMS, which is like a free software open source DAW. I used that for one attempt at a track. It was kind of rough. It's a place to start if that's what's accessible to you. Honestly, my best advice is there's a variety of ways to obtain FL Studio and Ableton and other tools, and consider the full variety of means by which one can acquire those pieces of software. But if you are trying to pick a DAW outside of LMMS, then FL Studio is where I started, and it's not what I used for Arcology or Armageddon. It is what I used for AstroSurf, and I actually think learning on it was really good for me. I think it was simpler and more immediate to get started with. But I'm also glad that I upgraded, quote unquote, to Ableton. I found it to be like a much more like expressive and powerful workflow for myself. But I think FL Studio is a good beginner one for a reason. Those are really the only two DAWs I've worked in. And I've heard that like Logic and Pro Tools and all those can be a little more complicated than either of the ones we've mentioned. But that's just by ear. You can also, if you're interested in synthesis and sound design, you don't necessarily need to be in a DAW. If you want to just start like learning how synthesis works, you can find free independent VSTs. Like a lot of Arcology, my debut album, used Synth 1. So just literally the words Synth 1, which is a free synth VST that you can play around with and learn how to like make noises and make sounds and make them sound interesting ways. And that you don't need to have a DAW to do. You can find something that hosts VSTs independently. But if you're going to move into making entire songs, I really do recommend trying to find a way to get your hands on something like FL Studio or Ableton or another DAW. You can lay down tracks in Audacity. You can play around in a VST and like record your input and put them next to each other. It's just going to be really limiting and take a lot more time. But that's also, limitation can be the mother of invention. And some people I know who were like limited to like only being able to like place samples around actually generated really interesting music from it. So you can also explore your limitations. It's just going to really restrict what you can do.
I would also add that software like Ableton and FL Studio goes on sale a lot. There's like a billion different music retailers. Surely you can find one that's got one on sale. Just as a point of note. Our other question this week comes from Propagable. in our Discord who asks, how do you find time for, well, everything?
That's a good question. This sounds like a person who follows me on Twitter. So at this point, I am pursuing an undergraduate degree in religion and Jewish studies and education, teaching kindergarten at a Jewish supplemental school on the weekends. I serve on the board of my congregation as the education committee representative. I'm an organizer in a collective of mostly communist and anarchist queer Jews. I write for my Patreon. I occasionally work on music. And I have a few other scattered tasks and projects here and there. And part of the answer is I'm not actually sure how I do all of that. But part of the answer is organizational tools. Everything in my life goes into Google Calendar. When I was trying to finish Archive and Arcology, like I had times in my calendar that were just labeled studio time. And like it didn't matter what I was doing, I needed to be producing in that time. And it was like I knew I had to block it out on my calendar and tell myself, I'm going to work on music in that time, or it wasn't going to get done. And when I was like working on improving my skills, especially before my releases, I needed to do like a little bit every day. So I had a couple weeks where I was like every day just plunking around in some way. And that was really important towards like improving my skills. But then on top of it, there's a bunch of other organizational tools that I use. Habitica, or also known as Habit RPG. It's like a little RPG where you get like gold for checking off to-do items. And the
Valkyries almost set up a group for that. The speedrunning organization group that I'm a part of. We almost used it. We talked about it in some of our private channels, but then we didn't end up following through for no particular reason.
I really recommend.
Dang, if only you'd been given some sort of incentive reward in the form of an RPG video game for setting it up. That would have gotten you there.
Yeah, I know. I won 50 experience points before downloading the app.
Signing bonus, but for RPGs. But Habitica has actually been really important in my life and continues to like help me keep track of the basic things that I need to do. And then when I'm preparing for a release musically, I keep this like Google Keep. Google Keep is this like checkbox and checklist and note software that Google has. And I'll have a Google Keep with a checkbox for each song. And then under each song will be like indented checks that are like every possible idea I can think of for like improving that song. So I talked about how often I'll just like listen to it while walking around. And sometimes those walks aren't as intentional. Sometimes it's not like to listen to it. I'm just like walking around the city. And so I'll be like, I have a perfect idea. I'm not going to be in front of my DAW for 36 hours. And I just pop out my phone, add to the Google Keep list, 48 seconds, remove snare, try adding triplet hi-hats. And so I'll just have this like running list that at its longest was probably like 45 items of just like between now and release date, try this. And so yeah, when I'm like multitasking with all of those different things, I have to keep it all in Google Docs and Google Keeps and Habitica and Google Calendar, and my life isn't just entirely electronically charted. I have like a list of all of the keys that Arcology was in just to be like, make sure I could do that like weird key thing. And it's all written down somewhere. And then there's meta layers of organization on top of that to keep them all interlinked. There's also one other way to answer that question, which is just find the things that really motivate you and really bring you a lot of joy, and find other people in your life who care about those things, and let yourself be as into them as you want to be. A lot of us grew up in a culture that really shames you for being like into something and like loving something with the whole of your heart. But when you find that thing that like really motivates you, lean into it. And don't be afraid to like love it in a way that's like dorky and nerdy and overly enthusiastic. I want everyone who hears this to know that that's like valuable. That sort of enthusiasm is just like so wonderful, whatever it's about. And lean into it and find people in your life who are going to like appreciate that and encourage you and lean into it too. And if you can, find people who want to do it with you. And things get so much easier to do when you're not doing them in isolation. So just like trying to find people who will support you and encourage you and support your enthusiasm and lean in.
God, that's advice that I've like finally been able to internalize recently, and I wish I had like been given 10 years ago. But anyway, It's time for our final segment of the podcast, which is Kaylee's question of the week. These are pretty normal questions. You know, they're the sort of things that, like, when you jack into a corporate computer to try to hack it, and you run up against the firewall, and you realize that you need to quickly figure out the administrator's security questions. These are the sort of things that might be on that list of security questions. We're all familiar at this point in the show with the Synthwave. Goes across the synth ocean. So what other elements of the synth beach, pick one element, I should say, of the synth beach that you would like to experience besides the waves?
Personally, I just really want to relax at the synth snack bar.
I want to build some synth castles.
Yes, my favorite locations, sand beaches.
My favorite band, Synth Castles. Thanks. Okay. What element of the synth beach do I want to take with me? I could really go for like some synth sun that I can just move into my room for the entirety of the length of winter. Thanks.
We have a pragmatist on the call tonight.
I can be a little bit utilitarian.
Oh my gosh. This is one of the least sensical questions I think we've had on this segment. But if you, listening right now, have an answer that you would like to give, use one of our various contact methods, give it to us, and we might read it on the next episode of the show during our closing segment. So,
and as a reminder, those are our Twitter at STRQueercast, our email address, settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com, and our STRQ community Discord, bit.ly/STRQcord. With that, this episode now draws to a comfortably gated reverb close. You know, shh. Nobody's gonna laugh at that. It's fine, though.
I had to stop myself from laughing.
Can we just get a cricket sound in the editing?
I also had to stop myself from making a granular synthesis joke about the beach. But like, there are like 3 people on the earth who would have appreciated that joke.
And one of them is a host of this podcast, apparently. All right.
Granular synthesis is a pain, but dang, it can make some weird sounds. Anyways, Jess, thank you so much for coming all the way over from online to come visit us here on Discord and spend some time with us. Where can our listeners find you and your work and your music and anything else you'd like to direct their attention to?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Jess from Online. So at Jess from Online. You can also find me at jessfrom.online, which is a fun URL that I have now. And then you can find my work on Bandcamp at liquidcrystal.bandcamp.com. All of my various projects under my umbrella are there. I also have a Patreon where I release some writing, both some exclusive writing and some that gets released out in the public. So that's patreon.com/jessfromonline. Hear about the sort of organizing work that I didn't talk as much about today. And yeah, I think those are my main outlets. I also have a Medium blog in which I release some of my writing, and that you can find linked on my Patreon will be the easiest way to find it.
We'll also put a link to all of this stuff in the show notes, so you can just go below the episode, click them.
Perfect.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can possibly, if you're feeling generous, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/settingtherecordqueer. Our patrons can get early guest reveals, access to a special Discord channel, high quality or early episode releases, and even special thanks on the show. We'd like to offer a special thanks to our $25 and above patrons, namely Jane, who you can find on Twitter as @ProcyonUltra. That's @PROCYON Ultra. Thank you so much, Jane. Otherwise, if you liked this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews and subscription numbers are so helpful for us. Please leave us a review. Hopefully a nice one, but like, you can feel free to be honest. I imagine, though, anyone who's still listening to the podcast at this point probably liked it, so don't have
5
anything to worry
stars
about on that
or
front.
you're banned from the Discord.
Basically. Not really. Also, you could tell a friend about us or recommend us on your social media. You can find us on Twitter at STRQueercast, via email settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com, or come hang out in our Setting the Record Queer community Discord, where you can spend time with other STRQ listeners, us hosts, and even some of STRQ's guests at bit.ly/STRQcord, all lowercase. While you're in any of those places, ask questions for us or our guests. Send us feedback about the podcast. Maybe you have a cool idea for who or what could be on this podcast. Maybe you think you should be on this podcast. We would love to hear from you. We are always looking for ideas. The logo for this podcast was drawn by Cubotic. That's at QBTIC on Twitter, or Cobot, QOBOT.tumblr.com. The theme music and production for this podcast is done by Thrill Me Music. You can find more information about her work at thrillmemusic.squarespace.com. Kaylee, where can our listeners find you?
People can find me on Twitter at WitchesHex. That's WITCHS Hex. They can follow SoulSync's development at SoulSync Game. That's SOULSYNC game. Also on Twitter. And hey, the RPG Valkyries next marathon, RPGs We Love 3, is coming up. I believe it's the week after this episode airs. It's going to be running all week over on twitch.tv/therepgvalkyries. Make sure to watch that. I think actually exactly 1 week from the day this episode comes out, I'm going to be running a tabletop campaign as part of that event. So that's going to be fun.
And you can find me on Twitch and Twitter at DoubleGearSYS, as in Double Gear System. Our next episode is going to be on emulator development, so we are very excited for that one, to say the least. But with that, thank you all so much for listening. Be sure to tune in a week from now for Kaylee's next Taking the Minutes, and a week after that, we will see you for yet another episode.
Bye.